What's up, traders? Happy Monday here, the first full week of trading in 2024. And we already made some mistakes. And nothing in a bad way, but something that I really want to address here because I think that it's really, really important just from a mental psychology standpoint. So I want to walk you guys through, not just do a normal nightly video and like, hey, here's what the market did and, give you my idea for tomorrow, right? But I want to actually walk you through my plan from today and then essentially like my deer in the headlights moment where I didn't do anything, and how this in the past and maybe even for you would have turned into some sort of spiral revenge type situation, and how essentially I was able to combat that and then actually turn it into a pretty decent day, all things considered. Right now, not as big of a day as what it could have been potentially here with the moves in which we saw out of Apple and NVDA, but let's dive into it. So the first thing I want to start with is going to be Apple here. And I just want to walk through the plan. So here's the Eric's Brain Dump channel inside the Discord chat here. And this is, starting off January 8th. So the first thing in which I saw today that I liked was Apple. And you'll notice I like where Apple's at on the daily. And then the next little note here was, everybody and their mother is watching Boeing thinking that it ultimately goes lower, right? Which it did get a really nice gap to the downside, right around 230 bucks. It was down like 20 bucks or so. But I didn't think that was going to be the trade of the day, right? I thought everybody was going to be watching that. And then I also said, there's nothing that's super clean here further down inside the write-up here. But the next thing in which I said was that NVIDIA looks good, but I want to wait for 498.35. So we've got Apple on the list. We've got NVIDIA on the list. And as we come down and we take a look at the rest of the plan for Apple was, hey, I like Apple over 182.08, but I wouldn't be surprised if it tried to fake lower first. All right, so we've got this 182.08 in Apple. We've got the 498.35s in NVIDIA, and we'll see how those come into play, right? Now, with Apple here, one of the things in which you guys have seen me talk about time and time again here over and over, right, is, hey, let's get an open above the level. Let's pull back and test the level. Let's then get back over the opening print, and then we can rally, right? That's a pretty standard, sequence or order of events in which I like to see in order for me to be able to enter the trades. Now, with Apple this morning, I talked about this where, hey, I wouldn't be surprised if it tries to fake lower first, which is a little bit more than a test, right? Now, someone asked, the reason in which I thought this and all of that. The reason in which I really thought it was just, I thought the market was going to ultimately try and shake us out a little bit. And given the move in which we'd seen out of Apple last week and the weakness in which I saw in there, it would kind of make sense. Like, hey, if the market does want to try and fake us out a little bit here today, then Apple's probably going to ultimately end up doing the same thing, right? Now, again, it didn't have to try and shake us out here. It could have just got the test and, the normal thing, right? But I didn't want to be scared out of it, if you will, if that's the right word to use, if it did try and act like it was going to go lower first, right? I didn't want to, shake myself out of this position here in Apple, which ultimately I didn't take any position in, if you haven't figured that out just yet. I completely missed this entire trade in Apple from the 182.08 here. It did everything literally almost down to the T according to the plan, right? And that's tough, right? I mean, it's 8 minutes into the day and this thing is just looking really, really, really good, right? Now, at the same time, here's what ultimately ended up happening to me. At the same time in which Apple was ultimately getting back up over that opening print, NVIDIA had gotten up over 498.35s and got that first little pullback here, right? So again, 8 minutes into the day here, we've got Apple above what Apple set up. It's done its thing. It's back up over the level in the open. NVIDIA here, I talked about it looking good, wanting it to get up through this 498.35s. And essentially all I ended up doing here was just becoming a deer in the headlights. And I was looking back and forth between either one of these charts, and I'm like, hey, I really like them both. NVIDIA has room to 520 bucks. We've been talking about that for a while. That was the earnings highs, from the overnight session that I've never traded. All of these things, right? And I ultimately just sat here, stared at the charts, and didn't act upon either of these names, which would have turned into, obviously NVIDIA. I think the 520 options in this thing, which again are a little bit further out of the money. I was kind of looking at it from that perspective. So I had options queued up in these, right? These things moved almost 1,000% today, right? From that initial, push up through 498.35 in this one little pullback, right? That's tough. Like, there's just no other way to put it, right? We've got Apple running without us. We've got NVIDIA now running without us. And it's like, basically they're like, this would have been the week maker, and maybe even the month maker, right? But the thing in which I did here, right, is I ultimately just continued to sit on my hands, and I said, okay, self, right? If I'm talking to myself, it's like, I know that these are good, valid trades. I know there's going to be more good, valid trades that ultimately come along. And what I can't allow to creep into my mindset is the FOMO, the revenge of like, hey, I need to find another good trade to make up for these two, which on the day, I don't really think there was one. I think these were the two best names on the board. And ultimately that's, again, tough. So what I was able to do by not getting myself worked up over these two trades, I was still able to just sit here calmly, look at the charts, and analyze it, right? And talk through what it is I was ultimately looking for. And I was able to find, again, it took a little bit longer, right? I was ultimately able to find an entry into gold, right? So this is /GC. This is a gold futures contract, right down in here at 2030.2. Now I got filled at 2030.2s and I got filled at 2030.1s on a couple of contracts for GC here. Now to put this into perspective, I ultimately ended up having 3 contracts on in this position. And this, again, it took, that trade was setting up in Apple and NVIDIA here within the first 8 minutes of the day. It took another basically 12 to 15 minutes for me to ultimately take a position in here from gold, right? Now, at the same time in which this is taking place, we'll also take a look at the Dow, and I'll show you a trade I took in there. And this one, we were able to actually hold and ride out, I think all the way right up into here. Yeah, we trailed under this bar here, so right up into 2040.20. So it was good for 10 points in gold. My target was 2046.20s. We managed this one on voice, actually, inside of Discord. So this one ultimately ended up turning out to be a really nice trade, right? And when you can catch 10 points in gold, that's $1,000 per contract, on the full-size contract, of course, here, on a Monday. Like, that's good, right? And I really didn't do anything from the standpoint of, like, after I found my entry, which was I was watching this 2029.40 level. I wanted to see the things in which I wanted to see, right? I was able to take my entry. It really didn't give any sort of, it didn't give me any pressure. It didn't give me any pullback here to really think about, like, hey, maybe I need to take this off. It didn't come near my stop loss, none of the things. And it was ultimately good for almost 5 Rs, right, on this trade. So it was a solid trade that I probably, had I gotten in my feels, wouldn't have taken this trade or would have somehow goofed it up, which is really, it's kind of tough to do this one, right? Or I would have held it too long and I would have given back instead of getting out up here at 2040s, right? I might have just closed it at the end of the day or just held this all the way back and I might have made 3 points instead of 10, right? I could have given back these 7 points, right? That's not what I wanted to do, right? I want to follow my rules. I want to be disciplined. I want to do all the things, right? So that ultimately ends up working out really nicely in my favor. And at the same time in which that trade is setting up in gold, I was able to take my position and all of these things. I was then also able to take a position here in the Dow. Now, the Dow had a level at 37,517. And I'm going to pull this over here. Now, again, I could have managed the Dow better. This was more of a scalp trade for me than it was anything else here. It ran for 400 points. I mean, the Dow on the day, grand total 452 point range. My fills on this were 37,522s here, right? And we scalped this up into opening print. So like, that's a good solid 60 point trade, right? I'll take that all day long in the Dow from the terms of a scalp perspective while I have this gold position on. While, yes, I just missed, really, really nice moves in Apple and NVIDIA, right? So for me, this one was just a straight up divergence trade. And as you guys know, like my two things here are ultimately just level to level and then divergence. And my face is going to be like somewhere right in the middle of this screen here. So let's do this. And all this is, again, like I said, is just a divergence trade. So you'll see right here at 950, S&P is pushing towards highs. NASDAQ obviously pushing towards highs. And then the Russell over here is pushing off of its lows. At the same time, the Dow is putting in and making these new lows, and i.e. gives us that divergence. Now, we were looking long off this 37,517 level, and it just becomes an added bonus, right, that we get that divergence in there, which constitutes just a really, really nice trade, right? And 60 points in here, it's $5 a point, so it ends up being good for, roughly $300 per contract, give or take, depending on if you got a point or two, obviously, on getting out there, right? So ultimately, had you held it all day from a trend perspective, it's good for maybe 400 points, right? You can make an argument for either or in terms of what this trade ultimately was. For me, it was just a scalp trade. I did see that potential there, but I just needed to hit that small little base hit, get my mentals right, still allow me to manage and hold out on the gold trade, essentially, and just do all the things, right? Like that's what I wanted it for. It checked all the requirements, it met all the boxes, and it did its thing. So ultimately, it ends up being really, really good. Now, this divergence trade in and of itself is something I've talked about a number of times here, and it's something that I put together all around what I call Trader Funding Challenge. So TraderFundingChallenge.com is going to teach you anything and everything about the divergence, all the ins and outs for that is going to be found there. But I wanted to go ahead and review the bigger key pieces here from today about the Apple miss, about the NVIDIA miss, and then how I was able to keep all of that under control, right? Knowing that, hey, there is going to be another trade, right? Any time that you miss a trade, yeah, it sucks, but the levels were right, the plan was right. I got deer in the headlights. My execution wasn't right. So if I know that my plan works and I've seen it work 1,000 times before, then why am I just going to go jump into something and revenge trade because I missed something that I planned for? Why would I get into a trade that I didn't plan just because I missed my trade that was planned, right? It just doesn't make any sense. And that's ultimately what it comes down to for a number, and I'm not attacking anyone in specific, right? But most of us have probably done it. And I'll raise my hand. I've done it before as well. But I'm now at a point where hey, I don't want to do those things, right? Because I know that, hey, that next trade I take that's unplanned is probably ultimately going to cost me A, money, and B, it's probably going to cost me my next good planned trade. So I'll leave you guys with that. Hopefully that makes sense. This video ran a little longer than I wanted it to. But overall, again, I hope that helps. If it did, please feel free to let me know. If you haven't already, click that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys on the next video. Peace.